Michael Stone, Michael H. Stone, M.D., Dr. Michael Stone, has written the definitive book on evil. The title of it is The Anatomy of Evil. I started doing show prep for this show with this book yesterday, Dr. Stone, and first of all, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
And sat down with your book thinking I would spend 15 or 20 minutes just bouncing around in it, getting ready to have this conversation with you, and ended up sitting in this chair for 3 hours, unable to move. This is absolutely fascinating and compelling, and I want to dig into many of the questions that this book evoked for me. First of all, the history of gradations of evil. Going all the way back to Dante and his circles of whatever it was in hell, up to your gradations of evil scale. Give us an overview.
Yes, well, Dante, 700 years ago, in his Inferno, had a kind of gradations because he had 9 circles, and each one was for people a little bit worse than in the circle before. But the things that he singled out were some similar and some very different from the kind of things that I was concentrating in my book, because my book was concentrating on violent crimes for the most part happening in peacetime, done by people that were not moved by war and or gang conflicts and things like that. So whereas Dante had both people that were doing terrible things in peacetime and people who were involved in
right. Although you
war.
have a fascinating discussion of war in here about how seemingly ordinary people go off to war, commit extraordinary violence and terrible things, and then they come back to life as seemingly ordinary people, and you point out that they're really not actually ordinary people. They were actually evil people all along who had a little more restraint than the average person, and war allowed them to reflect the really evil side of themselves, if I'm saying that well.
I think that's about right. I would, for instance, Lieutenant Calley, that a lot of us got familiar with during the Vietnam War, because of the My Lai massacre, did have, I think, a pretty bad past and a kind of a bad record. So he was not a good guy, and I don't know what's become of him since. So I think a fair number of soldiers, for example, that get involved in torture crimes or the Abu Ghraib type of stuff, some of them have had bad homes, or they've had poor records of self-restraint and things of that sort.
Right.
I don't want to say that that's true 100%, but I think many of them who've done those things, especially from our country where we put such a value on fighting within moral rules, even in warfare, they're not the best people.
Yeah, or at least we used to put a value on it. I'm curious, what, in your opinion, is the cause of evil? I know you go into the book, a whole spectrum of things from head injuries to drug abuse to the genetics of low levels of serotonin, the MOA, I'm assuming the monoamine oxidase stuff, dopamine receptors, and the genetics of it. You get into child violence during childhood, violent childhood abuse, and other kinds of childhood abuse. But really, at its core, what causes evil?
Well, I think you have to look at it this way. The word evil is something you and I and journalists and people in ordinary life and prosecutors and judges will use when they confront or hear about something that is particularly horrifying, even to the point of just making you wince and feel nausea. I think of one example I was using lately is that of John Evander Cooey down in Florida that raped that 6-year-old girl and then buried her alive. I mean, it's just incredible. And when you hear a story like that, you just go, you have an expression on your face.
Say, that is evil.
And people then say, oh, that was evil. So that's my definition. Now, the question is, what are the things that contribute to that? Well, as you mentioned the whole menu there, as I did in the book, and there isn't any one-size-fits-all set of factors that contribute to it. And some people, and I mentioned some of those later on in the book too, they really do seem to have what used to be called bad seed, like in that movie, where they didn't have anything happen to them. They were growing up in a nice family. They didn't fall on their head. In childhood, they didn't have brain disease like meningitis or epilepsy, and nothing bad happened to them. And yet they ended up, you couldn't tell from the nursery, mind you, when they were babies, what they were going to.
But they ended up like Ted Bundy.
But they ended up like Ted Bundy, so that there's some people where there's a strong genetic factor to being a psychopath. In other words, not having compassion for anybody.
Right.
Not
You write also about white-collar psychopaths, that there's no shortage of psychopaths who, instead of taking out their evil by raping and murdering and torturing, do it in the boardroom.
Yes, as a matter of fact.
In the workplace.
Yeah, the word evil is not very often used for white-collar criminals, but I thought I was really amazed and kind of interested when I read in the New York Times, must have been 2 weeks ago, that the judge in the Bernie Madoff case, when he sentenced him to 150 years, said, what you did was extraordinarily evil, or you're an extraordinarily evil man. Extraordinarily evil. And, of course, the evil there is because of the magnitude. And as a matter of fact, in a way, Bernie did kill a bunch of people because he contributed to the tremendous loss of their fortunes and funds of so many people that some of the bankers that invested with him, like that French guy, committed suicide. Absolutely. So there's a chain of suicides there that you can. The string goes back to Bernie.
We're talking with Michael Stone, M.D., the author of a brilliant new book, The Anatomy of Evil, very thought-provoking. Dr. Stone, it was about a decade ago, a book was published called Dancing with a Ghost, and I can't remember the name of the author. It's been at least a decade since I read it, although I have it at home. And he was a lawyer, just a regular Western-trained lawyer, Canadian, who went up into the Northwest Territories to work with the Aboriginal and Indigenous people in their interfaces with the criminal justice system. And there were these cultural clashes, collisions. For example, there was a woman who actually watched as her son hung himself and didn't stop him. And her culture forbade her from interfering. And our culture accused her of manslaughter. And he went up to defend her. But one of the things that he noted was that in those indigenous cultures, that there was very little what we call evil. That the rare cases of violence were self-directed. The one thing I didn't find in reading your book, and I confess I didn't read every single page in it, but I read an awful lot of it, was a discussion of transcultural evil. Evil in Aboriginal and Indigenous societies versus Western society versus communist society versus Chinese, Asian societies. Thoughts on that?
I do have some thoughts about that. As a matter of fact, I've been thinking about getting together another book that focuses on that very thing. The evil in larger contexts, wartime groups, different cultures. But I did mention one cultural item in there, and that was the fact that in some, not all, but in some Islamic countries, especially the ones that are more near the epicenter of the culture, which would be Saudi Arabia and Jordan and places like that, they do go in for a certain amount of honor killing. Right. And when they get transplanted over here or in England, you're supposed to abide by America's laws or England's laws, but some of them don't. And there's a case in the book, you may have gotten that far, where this fellow from Palestine was over here, and he was really part of a terrorist group. And he was...
Sir, we have to wrap it up here. But,
okay. He killed his daughter because she dared to date an American black guy, very nice fellow, that was culturally unacceptable to him. So he and his wife held her down and killed her.
Yeah, and that we consider evil, and they considered what the culture taught them to do.
That's right.
Dr. Michael Stone, the author of The Anatomy of Evil, an extraordinary and thought-provoking book. Dr. Stone, thanks for dropping by today.
Well, thank you.
Much appreciate the conversation. 16 minutes past the hour. And what are your thoughts on evil? I wonder about George W. Bush. Was he evil?